injured during the strikes, and I will continue to pray for their families. Secretary Hegseth, over the course of the war with Iran, I have repeatedly expressed concerns regarding the administration's lack of a winning strategy and repeated contradictions about the state of the war. It frankly doesn't help that you and your president continues to mislead the American people. You and the president have repeatedly said that the war, as we've heard over and over again, is almost over or already won. In fact, the president alone has said the war is almost over more than 30 times. On March 1st, the president said, we'll be done in 4 or 5 weeks. On March 9th, he said the war was very complete. On April 8th, he declared total and complete victory, 100%, no question about it. On the same day, you declared Operation Epic Fury was a historic and overwhelming victory on the battlefield, a capital V military victory by any measure. And yet today, July 21st, we have soldiers whose remains are sadly going to be returned to their deeply grieving families tomorrow. Clearly, the war is not over yet. After months of conflict, our strategy to win remains unclear. I have long said the United States has the strongest military in history in the world, and I have no doubt that our brave service members can execute any mission and prevail in any battle. But without a clear winning strategy, we're at risk of being in another forever war that'll put our service members in continued harm's way and continue to cost taxpayers billions of dollars. Secretary Hegseth, despite your failure to win this war, you are back now before Congress asking for almost $70 billion in additional funding. You're asking the American people for a blank check because, once again, the Trump administration's efforts have been an utter and complete failure to win this war to this point. So my question for you, sir, is how is your strategy different than what we've seen in the past? So far, we have not seen a strategy that's been successful. You mentioned nuclear material as the primary goal of the war. It still exists. We haven't dealt with that issue yet. You talk about the destruction of missiles, and yet the missiles that we saw hit recent targets are actually somehow more lethal, more deadly, more maneuverable than what we have seen in the past. So they're obviously improving their munitions. The Strait of Hormuz is still closed, reminding everybody it was open before the war. Prices were lower for everybody until the war, and it still remains closed. And of course, tragically, people, service members, our war fighters, who we care deeply about, are still dying. So what's different? Mr. Hegseth, Secretary Hegseth.
I think your characterization of this incredible effort as a failure is reckless. And I think it's irresponsible. And I think it smears the sacrifice of the troops that are out there making on behalf of the American people to ensure that Iran never gets a nuclear weapon. Shame on you and others who call this a quagmire and a failure, and then you want to turn around and say you support the warfighter. Either you do or you don't.
Is the nuclear material still there, sir?
I can get you a ticket out to CENTCOM and talk to what those Americans are doing, and how committed they are to this effort, and how they want to ensure that Iran never threatens their families with a nuclear weapon. That's the kind of intensity that our warfighters have about making sure that Iran isn't capable of doing that.
Secretary Hegseth, if you listen to my comments, you would have heard me say how amazing our warfighters are.
I heard failure. And the word heard. I heard exactly what you said.
I will tell you how I use the word failure, because I use the word failure to their leaders. You, sir, are the failure, not the men and women who are on that front line, not the men and women who hold up their honor with distinction. But if there's a lack of a winning strategy, they're in harm's way. Their leaders have failed them. And that's what's happening. We have political leadership. You don't have a strategy. You don't have a long-term plan to actually win this war. Win the war. The men and women are going to be able to do it, but they need to have leadership. When will you show leadership? When will you show leadership?
Why don't you show some leadership and stand up to your fellow Democrats who won't fund the troops, who stand and play partisan politics while you don't give us the money? You want to stand up here and talk about the troops? You won't show any political courage to actually fund our department because you have Trump derangement syndrome and can't actually commit to anything meaningful. So I put this on you, Senator.
Secretary Hegseth, you have trillions, you have over $1 trillion, you're asking for $1.5 trillion. It's not a question of money, it's a question of leadership and understanding what it takes to actually win.
Political cowardice of Democrats who won't fund the troops.
The confrontation unfolded during a Senate Appropriations Committee session focused on a major supplemental funding request tied to the ongoing operations. Peters began by acknowledging the service and sacrifice of those who have been in harm's way, then moved directly into his core criticism. He argued that the administration had repeatedly signaled progress or even victory at moments when the facts on the ground continued to show unresolved problems. Nuclear material questions remain open according to multiple assessments. Regional adversaries have adjusted their tactics and equipment. Pressure on the Strait of Hormuz has not fully eased, and American personnel continue to face risk. In Peters' view, those realities add up to a leadership shortfall that leaves the mission without a clear finish line and keeps costs climbing without a corresponding sense of closure. Hegseth rejected the characterization in strong terms. He described the senator's language as reckless and irresponsible, insisted that the men and women carrying out the mission remain highly motivated and effective, and accused Democratic members of using the hearing to score political points rather than to support the Department of Defense with the resources it needs. The Secretary framed the funding request as a practical necessity after months of intensive activity, arguing that any delay or reduction would only complicate the effort to degrade the other side's capabilities and protect critical shipping lanes. The two officials remained at an impasse, with Peters returning to the theme of strategy and accountability and Hegseth steering the discussion toward what he called political hesitation in Congress. The numbers attached to the conflict give the argument its weight. Official figures presented at the hearing placed the cost so far at approximately $37.5 billion, a total that has risen from earlier estimates issued earlier in the year. The broader request under discussion runs into the high tens of billions and is intended to replenish munitions stocks and sustain operations through the coming months. Reports indicate that nearly 20 American service members have lost their lives in connection with the fighting and that several hundred have sustained injuries. Those human costs sit alongside continued disruptions in one of the world's most important maritime corridors and ongoing debate about how thoroughly key facilities and programs have been affected. Hegseth noted during testimony that certain outside powers have provided forms of assistance to Iran, though he emphasized that the United States is working to discourage deeper involvement by those parties. What stands out in the exchange is how cleanly it divides two competing stories about the same set of events. One narrative holds that determined military pressure has already produced significant results, forced difficult choices on the other side, and demonstrated American resolve in a volatile region. The opposing narrative maintains that early language about decisive outcomes created expectations that have not been met, that the absence of a publicly detailed end-state risks open-ended commitment, and that further funding without clear strategic markers simply extends an expensive and uncertain effort. Online discussion and commentary have amplified both views, with some observers suggesting internal differences may exist over the administration's preferred balance between continued strikes and diplomatic channels, while others treat those suggestions as unverified speculation rather than established fact. Officials on all sides have been careful to separate their disagreements over policy from their stated respect for the personnel executing the missions. The hearing did not resolve any of those larger questions. It did, however, place them in sharp relief at a moment when the administration is seeking substantial additional resources and when the conflict itself shows no immediate sign of winding down. Shipping through the Strait of Hormuz continues to face intermittent pressure that affects global energy markets. Assessments of remaining nuclear-related capacity vary, depending on the source. The human toll, while still limited compared with past major wars, is real and continues to grow with each new incident. Against that backdrop, the personal clash between Peters and Hegseth functions as a concentrated expression of a wider argument about leadership, timing, and definition of success. Peters' insistence that the current approach lacks a winning strategy and places troops at prolonged risk reflects a broader democratic critique that has appeared in several hearings this year. Hegseth has countered that such criticism undermines the force and ignores the progress already achieved reflects the administration's consistent public line. Neither side appears ready to adjust its position in any meaningful way. The funding package remains under review, operations continue on their present course, and the public is left to weigh two incompatible descriptions of the same reality. One side sees failure of planning and communication. The other sees failure of political will. The intensity of the moment is heightened by the speed with which the clips circulated. Within hours of the hearing, reactions poured in from across the political spectrum. Some viewers praised Peters for refusing to accept vague assurances and for focusing attention on the human and financial ledger. Others defended Hegseth for refusing to accept what they viewed as an opportunistic attack during an active conflict and for keeping the focus on the readiness of the force. The divide mirrors larger patterns visible in coverage of the conflict since its early phases, when initial strikes were followed by claims of major degradation that later assessments complicated. Each new cost update and each new report of casualties has refreshed the same underlying debate rather than settling it. Looking further out, the unresolved issues extend beyond the immediate funding fight. Questions remain about how long the current operational tempo can be sustained, whether additional resources will produce qualitatively different results, and how the United States intends to manage the economic ripple effects that flow from any prolonged disruption of critical waterways. Some analysts have pointed to the involvement of other major powers as a complicating factor that could limit the range of available options, though the precise extent of that involvement is still described in cautious and often incomplete terms by official sources. Others focus on the domestic political calendar and the degree to which partisan incentives may shape the willingness of either side to compromise on language or numbers. Through all of it, the central tension highlighted in the hearing persists. American personnel remain engaged in a demanding set of missions. The financial commitment has already reached tens of billions and is projected to grow. The strategic picture continues to be described in sharply different terms depending on who is speaking. Peters used the hearing to argue that leadership must supply a clearer plan if further sacrifice is to be justified. Hegseth used the same forum to argue that leadership is already delivering results and that the greater risk lies in undercutting the effort through political resistance. The two positions cannot both be fully correct, yet both continue to command significant support. As the committee continues its work and as operations proceed, the word